The morning of August 4th, 1944, broke over the French countryside with a peculiar stillness that made every soldier of the Third Army uneasy. The air hung thick with moisture, and a pale fog crept across the hedgerows of Normandy like ghostly fingers reaching out from another world. For Sergeant James Murphy of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, this was just another day in what had become a grinding, exhausting war of attrition. But before the sun would set on this seemingly ordinary morning, his mistake would change the course of history. Murphy was 26 years old, though the war had aged him beyond his years. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the steering wheel of the lead supply truck with the kind of white-knuckled intensity that only months of combat could produce. Behind him stretched a convoy of 17 vehicles laden with fuel, ammunition, and rations desperately needed by the forward units pushing deeper into France. The responsibility weighed on him like a physical burden, settling between his shoulder blades and refusing to let go. General George S. Patton's Third Army had been unleashed just days before, and the speed of their advance had been nothing short of breathtaking. After weeks of bitter fighting in the Norman hedgerows, Operation Cobra had finally shattered the German defenses, and Patton's armored divisions were now racing across France like a storm that couldn't be contained. But speed required fuel, and fuel required men like Murphy to deliver it through enemy territory, past ambush points, and across a landscape still crawling with desperate German soldiers. The sky above was beginning to brighten, though the sun remained hidden behind layers of gray clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Murphy squinted at the hand-drawn map spread across the dashboard, its edges curled and stained with coffee, mud, and what might have been blood. The roads in this part of France weren't marked on any official military maps. They were farm tracks, narrow lanes that wound between stone walls older than America itself, paths that had been walked by peasants and nobles for 1,000 years before the first tank ever rumbled across European soil. His orders were simple. Follow Route 12 northwest to the forward supply depot at a small town called Avranches, where Patton's armored columns were gathering for the next phase of the offensive. The route had been cleared by reconnaissance units that morning, or so headquarters claimed. But in Murphy's experience, cleared didn't mean safe. It just meant nobody had been attacked there recently. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Private Danny Torres, a kid from Texas who never stopped talking. Torres was 19, fresh-faced despite the dirt that seemed permanently embedded in his skin, and possessed an optimism that Murphy found both admirable and exhausting. Torres was fiddling with the radio, trying to pick up something, anything, that wasn't static or German propaganda. The convoy rolled forward at a steady 20 miles per hour, slow enough to navigate the treacherous roads, but fast enough to make decent time. The sound of engines filled the air, a mechanical symphony that drowned out the morning songs of birds that somehow still sang despite the war. In the distance, Murphy could hear the rumble of artillery, a constant reminder that the fighting was never far away. They had been driving for almost an hour when Murphy saw the fork in the road. It appeared suddenly, emerging from the fog like a question mark. To the left, the main road continued northwest, disappearing into a dense forest that looked ancient and impenetrable. To the right, a smaller track branched off, winding through open farmland toward what appeared to be a small village in the distance. Murphy slowed the truck and studied his map again. According to the intelligence report, Route 12 went left. The thick line drawn in red ink on his map clearly indicated the forest route, but something didn't feel right. The forest was too quiet, too still. In his gut, that instinctive place where soldiers learn to trust their feelings over their orders, something was screaming at him to stop. Torres noticed the hesitation. He leaned over to look at the map, his young face creased with confusion. Murphy could feel the eyes of the entire convoy on him. 17 vehicles sitting idle on a French country road, waiting for their leader to make a decision. In war, hesitation could get you removed, but so could stupidity. The left path into the forest was darker, the canopy of trees creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Murphy had fought in the Ardennes, had seen what German forces could do when they had cover and preparation. Every instinct he possessed was telling him that Forrest was wrong, that something waited in those shadows. Without fully understanding why, Murphy turned the wheel to the right. The truck lurched slightly as it left the main road, its tires finding purchase on the smaller track. Behind him, the The convoy followed without question. That was the nature of military convoys. You followed the vehicle in front, trusted the man leading, and hoped he knew what he was doing. Torres looked at Murphy with wide eyes. The kid had seen the map too, knew they were deviating from orders. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. Then Torres asked the question that Murphy had been asking himself. Why? Murphy didn't have a good answer. He muttered something about the forest looking wrong, about wanting to take a safer route. But the truth was more complicated than that. It was a feeling, an intuition, born from months of survival, from watching good men die because they followed orders instead of their instincts. He couldn't explain it, not in words that would make sense to headquarters. So he simply drove, following the smaller road toward the unknown. The farmland they entered was devastated. Fields that should have been golden with wheat were churned mud, cratered by shells and scarred by tank tracks. Stone farmhouses stood in ruins, their walls collapsed, their roofs open to the sky. Occasionally they passed the burnt-out hulk of a German vehicle, or the grave of a soldier, marked by a simple cross and a helmet. The landscape was a testament to the savage fighting that had raged through here weeks before. As they drove deeper into the countryside, something unexpected happened. The road, which had started as a narrow farm track, began to improve. The surface became smoother, the path wider. Old cobblestones appeared, worn by centuries of use, but still solid. Murphy realized they were following an ancient trade route, something that dated back to medieval times or beyond. The village they had seen in the distance turned out to be little more than a cluster of damaged buildings around a stone church. As the convoy rolled through, Murphy saw faces peering from cellars and broken windows. French civilians, farmers, and shopkeepers who had survived the occupation and the liberation, watching the Americans pass with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Beyond the village, the road continued to improve. It curved gently northeast, following the contours of the land with the kind of natural logic that only centuries of use could create. Murphy consulted his map again, trying to figure out where they were. If his calculations were correct, they were actually moving parallel to Route 12, but several miles to the east. That's when Torres spotted the bridge. It emerged from the landscape like a gift. A beautiful stone arch spanning a river that Murphy recognized from his briefings. This was the Saloon River, one of the major obstacles between Patton's current position and his objectives to the north. According to intelligence, all the bridges across the Saloon in this sector had been destroyed by retreating German forces. But here, impossibly, was a bridge. Old, certainly. The stonework looked medieval, the kind of construction that had been built to last centuries, and it had been damaged. Part of the eastern approach showed signs of demolition attempts. Scorch marks blackened the ancient stone, and one of the support pillars showed cracks from explosive charges, but the bridge stood. Murphy stopped the convoy and walked forward to inspect the structure. His boots echoed on the stone as he crossed, testing each step, looking for signs of further damage or traps. The Germans had tried to destroy it, that much was clear. But either they had been interrupted or they had underestimated the bridge's strength. The medieval masons who built this crossing had done their work too well. On the far side of the river, Murphy saw something that made his heart race. Tank tracks, fresh ones, still visible in the soft earth at the river's edge. American tracks, he was sure of it. Sherman's, judging by the width and pattern. That meant forward units had already crossed here, or tried to. But when? And why hadn't this crossing been reported? Torres called out from the convoy. They had company. Murphy turned to see 3 military vehicles approaching from the north, moving fast. For a tense moment, everyone reached for weapons, fingers finding triggers, hearts pounding. Then someone recognized the markings. 3rd Army. Friendlies. The vehicles screeched to a halt, and out jumped a young captain with the kind of frantic energy that spoke of men operating on adrenaline and coffee. His name was Richardson, and he was a logistics officer attached to the 4th Armored Division. His words came out in a rush, and what he said changed everything. Richardson explained that the forward units were stalled. The planned supply route through Avranches had become a bottleneck, with thousands of vehicles trying to push through a single corridor while German forces harassed them from the flanks. Patton was furious, Richardson said. Absolutely livid. The general's entire strategy depended on speed, on maintaining momentum, on not giving the enemy time to reorganize. But now, just when they needed to move fastest, the supply lines were choking. Murphy showed Richardson the bridge, the road they had taken, the route through the farmland. The captain's eyes widened as he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just a bridge, it was a lifeline, an entire secondary supply route that could bypass the bottleneck at Avranches. If they could get this information to headquarters, if they could redirect even a fraction of the supply convoys through here, they could keep the advance moving. Richardson grabbed his radio and started calling up the chain of command. Murphy and his men watched as the captain argued, explained, and finally convinced someone at headquarters to listen. Within the hour, reconnaissance units were dispatched to survey the full route. By afternoon, the first supply convoys were being redirected, but the story of Murphy's wrong turn was just beginning. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in the Third Army. As word spread about the discovery of this alternate route, it reached the ears of General Patton himself. The general, who had been pacing like a caged lion at his headquarters, frustrated by the delays and bottlenecks, immediately grasped the significance. Patton ordered a massive realignment of his logistics. Instead of funneling everything through the congested main routes, he would split his supply lines. The heavier traffic would continue through Avranches, but a significant portion would now use what he started calling the Murphy Road. The general even sent a personal message to the sergeant, though Murphy wouldn't receive it for several days. The message was vintage Patton, profane and praising in equal measure, thanking Murphy for his initiative and his guts. Over the next 3 days, the Murphy Road became one of the busiest thoroughfares in France. Thousands of vehicles passed over that ancient stone bridge, carrying the fuel and ammunition that would allow Patton's army to maintain its breakneck pace. Engineers reinforced the damaged sections, widened the approaches, and established traffic control points along the route. The impact on the campaign was immediate and profound. With supplies flowing through 2 major routes instead of one, the Third Army's advance accelerated. Patton's tanks pushed deeper into France, liberating towns and villages at a pace that shocked both the Allies and the Germans. The Falaise Gap was closing, trapping thousands of German soldiers. The liberation of Paris was suddenly within reach. Murphy and his convoy became minor celebrities. Reporters interviewed him, though Murphy remained characteristically modest about the whole affair. When asked why he had turned right instead of left, why he had disobeyed his orders, Murphy struggled to explain. It was just a feeling, he said. Something didn't seem right about the main road. Maybe it was luck, or maybe it was divine intervention. Murphy wasn't a particularly religious man, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger than himself had guided his decision that morning. Years later, after the war, investigators would piece together what had actually happened that August morning. The route Murphy was supposed to take, the Forest Road, had indeed been prepared for an ambush. A retreating German unit, cut off from their main forces, had laid mines and positioned anti-tank weapons in the trees. They had been waiting for exactly what Murphy was delivering, a supply convoy with minimal escort. If Murphy had followed his orders, if he had turned left instead of right, the entire convoy would have been destroyed. The men would have perished, the supplies would have been lost, and the Third Army's advance might have been delayed by crucial days. But Murphy didn't know any of that as he sat in his truck on that foggy August morning, watching convoy after convoy rumble past on the road he had discovered. All he knew was that he had trusted his gut, had made a decision based on instinct rather than orders, and somehow it had worked out. He thought about all the times in the war when such decisions had gone the other way, when gut feelings had been wrong, when good men had died because of choices made in split second. War was like that, he reflected, a constant series of decisions made with incomplete information, where the difference between hero and fool was often nothing more than luck. Torres, sitting beside him, was grinning like he'd won the lottery. The kid was already embellishing the story, turning Murphy's hesitation at a crossroads into an act of strategic genius. Murphy let him talk. Let the kid have his story. The truth was more complicated and less heroic. Murphy had been scared, uncertain, and had made a decision he couldn't fully explain. That it had turned out well was fortune, not skill. But as the days passed and the full significance of the Murphy Road became clear, even the sergeant had to admit that something remarkable had happened. The bridge they had discovered turned out to be one of only 3 intact crossings of the Saloon River in that entire sector. The road, which had seemed like a random farm track, was actually a remnant of an ancient Roman road, one of the trade routes that had connected European cities for thousands of years. Medieval merchants had traveled this path. Armies during the 100 Years' War had marched along it, and now, in 1944, it was helping to liberate France from occupation. The engineers who surveyed the route were amazed by its quality. Despite centuries of neglect and recent damage from fighting, the fundamental infrastructure was sound. The road followed the natural contours of the land, avoiding steep grades and unstable soil. The bridge, built by medieval masons whose names were lost to history, had withstood everything from spring floods to German demolition charges. It was a testament to the skill of ancient builders and a reminder that some things in this world were built to endure. Patton's Breakout, fueled in part by the supplies flowing through Murphy's discovered route, became one of the most spectacular military advances in history. In the weeks following that foggy August morning, the Third Army would race across France at speeds that seemed impossible. Towns and cities fell in rapid succession. German units, already reeling from the D-Day invasion and the grinding battles in Normandy, found themselves unable to establish defensive lines. Everywhere they turned, American forces were already there, cutting off retreat routes, capturing supplies, and forcing surrenders. The liberation of Paris came on August 25th, just 3 weeks after Murphy's wrong turn. As Parisians celebrated in the streets, as the Free French forces marched through the Arc de Triomphe, few of them knew about the sergeant from Oklahoma who had accidentally discovered a medieval road that helped make it all possible. Murphy certainly didn't think about it. By then, he and his convoy were hundreds of miles away, delivering supplies to new forward positions, facing new dangers, making new decisions with incomplete information and too little time. The war would continue for another 9 months after the liberation of Paris. Murphy would survive, though not unchanged. He would see more combat, lose more friends, and make countless more decisions where the line between right and wrong, between survival and catastrophe, was impossibly thin. But whenever the memories became too heavy, whenever the weight of what he had seen and done threatened to crush him, he would think about that foggy morning and the fork in the road. He would remember the feeling in his gut that told him to turn right. He would remember Torres's nervous chatter, the ancient bridge emerging from the mist, the look on Captain Richardson's face when he realized what they had found. And he would remember that sometimes, in the chaos and terror of war, the smallest decisions could have the largest consequences. The story of Murphy's wrong turn spread through the Third Army and eventually into the broader mythology of World War II. Different versions emerged, each embellished in its own way. In some tellings, Murphy was a brilliant tactician who had studied ancient Roman roads and deliberately sought out the crossing. In others, he was divinely inspired, guided by Providence to save his men and his mission. The truth, as always, was more prosaic and more profound. Murphy was a man doing his job under impossible circumstances, making decisions with incomplete information, trusting his instincts when logic and orders pointed elsewhere. He was scared and uncertain, burdened by responsibility and exhausted by war. And in one crucial moment, when he stood at a fork in the road with 17 vehicles depending on his choice, he made the decision that felt right, even if he couldn't explain why. The medieval bridge still stands today, more than 80 years after Murphy's convoy crossed it. A small plaque was installed after the war, commemorating its role in the liberation of France. Tourists occasionally stop to take photographs, admiring the ancient stonework and the peaceful river flowing beneath. Few of them know the full story of that August morning in 1944, of the sergeant who made a wrong turn that turned out to be right. In the broader scope of World War II, Murphy's discovery was a footnote, a small moment in a vast conflict that reshaped the world. But for the men of the Third Army, for the soldiers who received their supplies because of that alternate route, for the French civilians who were liberated weeks earlier than they might have been, it was everything. It was the difference between success and failure, between life and loss, between stagnation and momentum. General Patton, in his personal diary, wrote about the importance of aggressive leadership and bold decision-making. He praised his officers and men for their initiative, their willingness to take risks and make unconventional choices. Though he mentioned Murphy by name only once, the principle behind the sergeant's actions was something Patton understood intimately. War rewarded audacity, punished hesitation, and sometimes demanded that soldiers trust their instincts over their orders. The German commanders who faced Patton's breakout were mystified by the speed and efficiency of the American advance. In their after-action reports and post-war testimonies, they struggled to explain how the Third Army maintained such a rapid pace despite the challenges of logistics and terrain. Some attributed it to American industrial might, the seemingly endless stream of supplies and equipment. Others pointed to superior intelligence or tactical innovation. None of them knew about the sergeant at a crossroads, the medieval bridge, and the Roman road that became a lifeline. That knowledge remained locked in American military archives, a small detail in the vast documentation of the war. It wasn't strategic genius or overwhelming force that had made the difference, though those certainly played their roles. Sometimes it was simpler than that. Sometimes it was one man making one decision at one moment and everything else following from there. Murphy returned home to Oklahoma after the war, to a small town where few people understood what he had experienced. He didn't talk much about his service, didn't boast about his role in the breakout or the commendation he received from Patton. Like many veterans, he carried the war inside him, a weight that never fully lifted but learned to coexist with the rhythms of civilian life. He married, had children, worked a series of jobs that never quite captured his interest the way that morning at the crossroads had. Every August 4th he would grow quiet, lost in memories of fog and fear and the feeling of a steering wheel in his hands. His family learned not to ask too many questions to give him space on that day. They knew he had done something important in the war, though the details remained vague and incomplete. It wasn't until the 1980s, when historians began interviewing surviving veterans and combing through archives, that the full story of Murphy's wrong turn began to emerge. A researcher studying Patton's logistics discovered references to the Murphy Road and began tracing its origins. Interviews with surviving members of the Convoy, cross-referenced with military records and engineering surveys, gradually reconstructed what had happened that morning. By then, Murphy was an old man, his hands still strong but marked by age and arthritis. When the historian finally tracked him down, arriving at his small house in Oklahoma with questions about a day 40 years past, Murphy was initially reluctant to talk. What was there to say? He had been scared, had made a guess, had gotten lucky. That wasn't heroism, that was survival. But as the historian pressed, as questions led to memories and memories led to stories, Murphy found himself transported back to that foggy morning. He remembered details he thought he had forgotten: the smell of diesel fuel and wet earth, the way Torres's voice cracked when he asked why they were turning, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as he made the decision to disobey orders, the relief and terror mixed together when the bridge appeared, standing when it should have been destroyed. He talked about the men in his convoy, most of them gone now, claimed by age or accident, or the delayed effects of a war that never fully released its grip. He remembered their faces, their names, the particular way each one moved and spoke. They had trusted him that morning, had followed where he led without question. The weight of that trust had been crushing then and remained heavy now, decades later. The historian asked if Murphy considered himself a hero. The old man laughed, a sound caught between bitterness and amusement. Heroes, he said, were the men who deliberately ran into gunfire to save their friends. Heroes were the medics who treated the wounded under fire, the pilots who flew against impossible odds, the infantry who took hills and bunkers at terrible cost. He was just a sergeant who got lost and stumbled onto a bridge. But even as he said it, Murphy knew it wasn't entirely true. He had trusted his instincts when orders said otherwise. He had taken responsibility for the lives of his men and made a choice that could have ended in disaster, but instead opened a path forward. Maybe that wasn't heroism in the traditional sense, but it was something. It was the kind of courage that came not from fearlessness, but from acting despite fear, from trusting yourself when everything was uncertain. The story of Murphy's wrong turn eventually found its way into history books, though usually as a small aside in larger narratives about Patton's breakout. It became a favorite anecdote in military leadership courses, used to illustrate the importance of initiative and to trusting junior leaders to make decisions in the field. The bridge was preserved as a historical site, and a more detailed plaque was installed explaining its role in the liberation. Murphy passed away in 1991, a few weeks after his 73rd birthday. At his funeral, attended by family and friends and a handful of elderly veterans who had served with him, someone told the story of the wrong turn to the assembled mourners. For many of them, it was the first time they truly understood what the quiet man had done during the war. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service, but focused more on his life as a father, husband, and member of the community. There was a single line about his role in facilitating Patton's advance across France, a modest acknowledgement of something extraordinary. That would have pleased Murphy, who never wanted to be remembered as a hero, but simply as a man who had done his job to the best of his ability under difficult circumstances. The Murphy Road is still visible today, though much of it has been paved over or incorporated into modern highway systems. The ancient bridge remains the same, weathered but solid, a connection between past and present. Sometimes military historians lead tours through the area, pointing out significant locations from the 1944 Breakout. They always stop at the bridge, tell the story of the sergeant and his wrong turn, and invite people to imagine what it must have been like on that foggy August morning. What they're really asking people to imagine is the weight of decision-making in war, the burden of responsibility, and the thin line between disaster and success. They're asking them to consider what they would have done at that crossroads, with incomplete information and lives, depending on their choice. Most people standing on the bridge in peacetime, with the sun shining and birds singing, can't really comprehend it. The fear and uncertainty, the exhaustion and pressure, the knowledge that hesitation or error could mean catastrophe. But sometimes a veteran will stand there quietly, remembering their own crossroads, their own moments of decision under fire. They understand what Murphy faced that morning. They know the particular kind of courage it takes to trust your instincts when everything else tells you to follow orders, to take responsibility for a choice that could go catastrophically wrong, to live with the weight of decisions made in the fog of war. The legacy of Murphy's wrong turn extends beyond military history. It's become a metaphor for the unexpected consequences of small decisions, for the way individual actions can ripple outward into larger outcomes. Business schools use it as a case study in leadership and decision-making under uncertainty. Psychologists reference it when discussing intuition and trusting gut feelings. It has become, in its own small way, a part of American mythology about World War II, but at its heart, it remains the story of one man at one crossroads on one foggy morning, making a decision he couldn't fully explain, trusting something deeper than logic or orders. It's a reminder that history is made not just by generals and presidents, but by sergeants and privates, by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and somehow finding the courage to act. The wrong turn that was actually right, the disobedience that saved lives, the accident that opened a path forward. That's the story of Sergeant James Murphy of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 3rd Army, and a medieval bridge over the Saloon River. It's a small story in the vast tapestry of World War II, but it's one worth remembering, one worth telling, one worth honoring, because in the end, that's what history is. Not just the sweep of armies and the fall of empires, but the individual moments when people like Murphy stood at crossroads and chose their path. Sometimes they chose well, sometimes they chose poorly, and sometimes when the fog was thick and the stakes were high, they trusted their instincts and found a way forward that no one had planned, no one had expected, and no one could have predicted. That foggy morning in August 1944 changed the course of a campaign, helped liberate a nation, and saved lives that would have been lost on a different road. And it all began with a sergeant who made a wrong turn that turned out to be exactly right.